The Carolina Panthers are 7-6, sitting on the edge of a playoff spot that almost nobody believed was possible 2 months ago. And the strangest part is that nobody can explain how they got here or what they will do next. This team does not follow patterns. One week they look completely lost, scoring 13 points or fewer in blowout defeats that make fans question the entire direction of the franchise. The next week, they walk into a stadium and dismantle a Super Bowl contender like the Los Angeles Rams, a team that had not trailed in weeks and featured Matthew Stafford playing at an MVP level. The record says 7 wins and 6 losses, but that number hides the chaos, the wild swings, and the fact that this team is somehow still alive in a division race that could end with them hosting a playoff game at home. What makes this season so confusing is that the Panthers have no identity that holds from Sunday to Sunday. You watch them get shut down 17-7 at home by the New Orleans Saints, an ugly performance where the offense stalls and the entire building feels deflated. Then you turn around and see them beat the Green Bay Packers, the Dallas Cowboys, the Miami Dolphins, and those same Rams who were rolling through opponents like nothing could stop them. The defense forces red zone interceptions, delivers pick sixes, and strips the ball in crunch time while the offense alternates between scoring 30 points in dominant fashion and going completely silent for entire halves. This is not a bad team learning how to win, and it is not a great team hitting its stride. This is a volatile group that keeps dragging the entire league into its unpredictable rhythm. And the only thing anyone knows for sure is that you cannot look away because the next game could go either direction without warning. At the center of all this madness sits Bryce Young, the player who somehow represents both the problem and the solution, depending on which week you catch him. One night he throws for 69 yards with 2 crushing interceptions against the San Francisco 49ers, looking lost in the red zone and missing open grass right in front of him. A week earlier against Atlanta, that same quarterback tears apart a secondary for 448 yards and 3 touchdowns in an overtime thriller where he looks completely in command of every read and every throw. Then against the Rams, with everything on the line and an MVP candidate staring at him from across the field, Bryce Young needs only 20 attempts to post 206 yards and 3 scores with 0 turnovers, moving calmly, reading coverage perfectly, and using his legs at exactly the right moment to flip field position. Some people see those swings and call it inconsistency. Others see a young quarterback learning how to carry a playoff push in real time. But the truth is more complicated than either side wants to admit. To understand why the Panthers make no sense right now, you have to zoom in on Bryce Young himself and watch how his game is changing week by week, snap by snap, in ways that might decide whether this franchise has found its future or is still searching for answers. But before we get into that, hit that like and subscribe button for more Panthers and all the NFL content. Let's aim for 300 likes on this video. Bryce Young has lived through a season that feels like 3 different careers compressed into 13 games. And the version of him that shows up each week determines whether Carolina competes for a division title or watches the playoffs from home. Against the San Francisco 49ers in primetime, he finished with just 69 passing yards and 2 interceptions that killed drives the defense had worked to create. The worst moment came in the red zone when he forced a throw into tight coverage instead of taking the easy yard sitting right in front of him. A decision that turned into a disaster pick and sucked all the energy out of the team. Yet rewind 1 week earlier to the Atlanta matchup, and you see a completely different player ripping apart a secondary for 448 yards and 3 touchdowns in overtime, looking confident on every snap and making throws that felt impossible to defend. Then came the Rams game where everything mattered, where Matthew Stafford stood across the field as an MVP favorite, and Bryce Young responded by needing only 20 completions to deliver 206 yards and 3 scores without a single turnover. That performance was not about volume. It was about precision, timing, and a calmness under pressure that looked nothing like the player who struggled just weeks before. The most critical development in Bryce Young's game is not just the numbers jumping from terrible to brilliant. It is how he is learning to use his legs as a weapon that changes the way defenses have to prepare for him. He is not a pure scrambler like Lamar Jackson or Michael Vick who can take over a game with designed runs. But when Bryce Young chooses the perfect moment to keep the ball on play action and slide into open field, that 120-plus yard scramble flips field position, breaks down the coverage structure, and forces the defense to respect his mobility for the rest of the afternoon. Against the Rams, he kept the ball when the edge collapsed, ripped off a long gain that moved the chains, and suddenly linebackers started hesitating on their drops because they could not trust that he would stay in the pocket. That hesitation creates windows in the passing game that did not exist before, and it gives his receivers just enough separation to make contested catches feel routine. The growth is not about becoming a running quarterback. It is about knowing when to pull the trigger and make defenses pay for forgetting he can move. What separates Bryce Young in 2025 from every other young quarterback fighting for credibility is what happens when the clock winds down and the season hangs on a single throw. He already has 5 game-winning drives this year and 11 since entering the league, a total that surpasses Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, and Jalen Hurts over that same stretch. Those are not empty numbers that look good in a highlight package. Those are moments where the entire stadium knows one bad read ends the season, and he still delivers. On 4th down against the Rams, he trusted his eyes, dropped a perfect deep ball to Jalen Coker with defenders draped all over him, then later found Tetairoa McMillan on another huge conversion when the defense expected something safe and short. The question that hangs over everything now is how much of this roller coaster comes from Bryce Young figuring out who he is as a player, and how much of it comes from the way the offense around him keeps changing week to week. That question leads straight into Dave Canales and the bizarre system he is trying to build in Carolina. A system that can look brilliant and broken in the same afternoon. Nothing captures the confusion surrounding this Carolina offense better than watching Dave Canales call plays on back-to-back drives that feel like they came from completely different coaching staffs. Some weeks the Panthers throw the ball 40 times and barely hand it off to Chuba Hubbard or Rico, almost forgetting they have 2 capable running backs who can control the clock and set up play action. Other weeks, Canales leans hard into the ground game, uses motion to create favorable angles, and builds a simplified passing plan that lets Bryce Young operate without feeling rushed or overwhelmed. Against elite defenses, you see long stretches where the offense goes nowhere, wasting possessions and leaving points on the field. Then, a few days later, the same play caller controls tempo, moves the chains consistently, and forces someone like Matthew Stafford to stand on the sideline watching his defense get worn down. It feels like 2 entirely different offensive minds are taking turns calling the game, and nobody can predict which version will show up when the ball gets snapped. The strangest part of this split personality is that both approaches clearly come from the same core philosophy, but the execution keeps shifting in ways that make no sense from the outside. Dave Canales wants balance between the run and pass, but his definition of balance changes every single week depending on matchups, momentum, or something only he understands. On one series, he will call a run on 3rd and medium that invites boos from the crowd because it feels too conservative. Then on the very next 4th down, he dials up a deep shot down the sideline to Jalen Coker instead of kicking a field goal and taking the points. He will pound the ball with Chuba Hubbard and Rico to set up play action, building a rhythm that makes linebackers freeze at the snap. Then suddenly he asks Bryce Young to hit a tight window throw downfield against press coverage when everyone in the building expects something safe underneath. When it works, the offense looks modern and fearless, with layered route concepts, misdirection that creates free runners, and play action that actually scares defenses into making mistakes. When it stalls, it looks like the Panthers cannot decide if they want to be a physical running team or a quick strike passing attack, and that indecision kills drives before they ever get started. This uncertainty in the system around Bryce Young matters just as much as his own development, because the nights where Dave Canales commits to power runs, uses Chuba Hubbard and Rico as a legitimate 1-2 punch, and schemes clean-throwing windows for Jalen Coker, Tetairoa McMillan, and JT Sanders are the nights where Carolina looks capable of beating anyone on the schedule. The mystery is not just which version of the coach will appear, but which weapons he decides to feature and how aggressively he uses them in critical moments. To really understand why this team swings from lifeless to explosive so quickly, You have to look at the playmakers on the field one by one and see how each of them changes what this offense can do when they get the ball in space. The Carolina Panthers have quietly assembled a group of skill position players who make life significantly easier for Bryce Young when Dave Canales actually uses them correctly. And the difference between good weeks and bad weeks often comes down to whether these guys get touched enough to impact the game. Chuba Hubbard and Rico are not just bodies rotating in and out of the backfield. They fundamentally change the rhythm and physicality of every drive they touch. One possession, you see Chuba Hubbard reading his blocks with patience, slipping through tight creases before defenders can fill gaps, and catching passes in the flat that turn into 12 or 15-yard gains because he has enough speed to get upfield. The next possession, Rico is lowering his shoulder on contact, dragging tacklers forward, and turning what should be 2-yard losses into tough first downs that keep the offense ahead of schedule. When both backs get consistent work, the defense never gets a chance to pin its ears back and rush the passer because they have to respect the run on every single snap. And that respect makes play action look real instead of like a cheap trick that fools nobody. On the outside, the passing attack has developed its own collection of matchup problems that opposing coordinators have to account for even when the game plan tries to take them away. Jalen Coker has become the trusted target who shows up when the down and distance look impossible. The guy who fights through contact on 4th down, sells his route hard enough to create just enough separation, and waits until the absolute last second to flash his hands for the ball. Across from him, Tetairoa McMillan brings a completely different skill set that makes him almost impossible to defend with a single coverage look. He has the size to win contested throws against smaller corners, but he moves like a slot receiver, running clean crossing routes that stress linebackers in space and punishing safeties who take a false step or get caught watching the backfield. Add in Xavier Legette using his body to bump defenders off their routes, and JT Sanders locking in crucial blocks on the edge while still being a threat in the passing game. And you get a group that quietly does the dirty work necessary to make those explosive throws from Bryce Young actually connect. These are not household names that show up on highlight reels every week. But they are players who understand their roles and execute when the game gets tight. The wild part about this collection of weapons is that they are still learning how to peak together at the same time, which explains why the offense can look unstoppable one week and completely stuck the next. When Dave Canales feeds Chuba Hubbard and Rico enough carries to establish the run, moves Tetairoa McMillan around the formation to create mismatches, gives Jalen Coker chances on money downs where his toughness matters most, and lets JT Sanders and Xavier Legette set the physical tone with their blocking and route running, the Panthers look like a complete offensive unit that can score on anyone. But even that only tells half the story of why this team keeps pulling off upsets and staying alive in the playoff race. The other half lives on defense, where a group of players keep stealing possessions, flipping momentum in seconds, and making game-saving plays that give the offense short fields exactly when they need help most. The Los Angeles Rams walked into Charlotte with Matthew Stafford playing at an MVP level and an offense that had not trailed in weeks, and on paper they should have controlled the game from start to finish. But the Carolina defense tore that script apart with a series of plays that felt like they came out of nowhere. A tip throw at the goal line suddenly floats into the hands of Nick Scott for an interception that kills a scoring drive. A confident outside route gets jumped by Mike Jackson, who takes it back the other way for a pick six that swings momentum completely. And a closing pocket late in the fourth quarter ends with Derek Brown ripping the ball loose on a strip sack that saves the entire game. These are not lucky bounces or mistakes by the offense. These are disciplined players reading their keys pre-snap, staying calm in their alignments, then exploding at exactly the right moment to create turnovers that change everything. The defense does not blitz wildly or take crazy chances. They play sound football until the ball comes out and then hands shoot up. Routes get jumped, and quarterbacks who thought they had clean throws suddenly look shocked that this group found another takeaway in the biggest moment of the afternoon. The faces behind those momentum-swinging plays are starting to feel like the true backbone of this team. The guys who show up every week regardless of what the offense does or how the game script unfolds. Derek Brown is the steady interior force who stuffs runs on one snap, collapses the pocket on the next, and knocks down passes that float into Nick Scott's coverage area for easy interceptions. Mike Jackson sits on routes like a veteran who has spent hours in the film room, trusting his eyes instead of playing scared or hesitating when he sees a throw coming his way. Even against elite receivers like Davante Adams and Puka Nacua, this secondary finds ways to win the downs that matter most, forcing incompletions on third down or making tackles short of the sticks when a first down would extend a drive. Rookie Lathan Ransom has come in and contributed immediately, timing blitzes that result in sacks, chasing down ball carriers from the backside, and finishing games with double-digit tackles that show up on every snap of the tape. When J.C. Horn is healthy, he erases entire sections of the field and lets everyone else play faster and more aggressive because they know he has his matchup locked down without needing help over the top. What makes this defensive performance even more impressive is how many key pieces have been missing at different points throughout the season, forcing Ejiro Evero to adjust his calls and trust depth players to step up in critical moments. Christian Rosaboom sits out with an injury, Trayvon Moehrig serves a suspension, J.C. Horn enters concussion protocol, and suddenly names like Chow Smith-Wade and Trevin Wallace are out there holding up their assignments while the coordinator keeps changing his scheme to match whoever is available that week. The result is a defense that might give up yards between the 20s but keeps stealing possessions in the red zone, saving points when the offense needs a stop, and handing Bryce Young short fields that make scoring feel inevitable. That combination of discipline and sudden chaos only works because the standard in the trenches and in the meeting room stays high no matter who suits up. And that standard comes from the foundation this team has built up front and in the coaching staff that refuses to let things fall apart. When you look past the explosive plays and the wild scoreboard swings, the real reason this Carolina team has survived its own inconsistency lies in the offensive line and the stability they provide even when everything around them keeps changing. Ikem Ekwonu holds down the blind side and protects Bryce Young's back on every dropback, while veterans like Austin Corbett and Taylor Moton anchor the right side and maintain a standard that keeps the entire unit accountable. The Panthers have already started 10 different offensive line combinations this season because of injuries, position changes, and adjustments to find the right chemistry. Yet Bryce Young still finds time to throw downfield and Chuba Hubbard, and Rico still find running lanes that let them hit the second level. Most teams would collapse under that kind of rotation and instability. But this group keeps protecting the quarterback and opening holes because the coaching staff has built a system that does not rely on one specific lineup staying together for 16 games. That kind of resilience in the middle of constant change is what allows Carolina to lean on long, sustained drives, instead of needing a miracle play every possession just to move the ball. The coaching piece ties directly into that physical foundation because Dave Canales and Ejiro Evero are building a team that wins with trust in the details rather than hoping for splash plays to bail them out when things get difficult. On offense, that trust means believing the line can hold up on those fourth down shots to Jalen Coker when the defense knows a pass is coming. Staying committed to the run game so that play action to Tedairoa McMillan actually freezes linebackers instead of fooling nobody. And giving JT Sanders real responsibility as a blocker on the edge instead of treating him like a decoy who just runs routes. On defense, the details show up in the stunts and twists that free up Derek Brown to penetrate gaps, the well-timed pressure packages that let Lathan Ransom shoot through openings before the offense can adjust, and coverage calls that allow J.C. Horn, Chow Smith-Wade, and Trevin Wallace to play fast without worrying about getting beat deep. When the coaches call the right play at the right time and the offensive line wins their matchups up front, the entire roster suddenly looks sharper, more confident, and capable of executing at a level that feels completely different from the weeks where they struggle. That is exactly why games like the upset victory over the Rams feel so different from the flat losses that happened earlier in the year against teams Carolina should have beaten. In those wins, the Panthers control the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball. The play callers stay aggressive without crossing the line into reckless decision-making. And the stars on offense and defense make the key plays that the scheme is specifically designed to create for them. It is not about getting lucky or catching an opponent on a bad day. It is about executing a formula that shows up clearly on film when this team is locked in and disappears just as fast when they slip on the fundamentals or lose focus for even a quarter. The next question facing this franchise is whether that formula can hold up through a brutal division race against the New Orleans Saints, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the Seattle Seahawks, where every single snap could be the difference between hosting a playoff game at home or watching the postseason from the couch. For all the wild swings and unpredictable results that have defined this season, everything keeps circling back to Bryce Young and what he represents for the long-term future of this franchise. Carolina traded valuable draft capital to move up and select him, invested heavily in building an offensive line to keep him upright, added weapons like Tyrone McMillan and Jalen Coker to give him targets he can trust, and hired Dave Canales specifically to develop him into a franchise quarterback. This year is not just about sneaking into the playoffs or winning a few more games than expected. It is about discovering what kind of leader you actually have when the pressure gets heavy and there is no excuse or safety net to fall back on. Every drive in these final division games tells the front office something critical about how Bryce Young handles chaos, how he lifts the teammates around him when things get tough, and how much you can truly trust him when the entire stadium knows something big is riding on the next throw. Those answers matter more than any stat sheet or highlight reel because they reveal whether this player has the mental makeup to carry a franchise for the next decade. The decision on his fifth-year option is where all of that trust and belief becomes concrete, where the organization has to put real money and commitment behind the path they chose when they drafted him. It is not simply a question of contract numbers or salary cap management. It is a public statement about whether you believe in the direction this team has taken and the player you have invested everything around. If Bryce Young guides this team through a brutal stretch against the New Orleans Saints, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the Seattle Seahawks, wins the games that matter most, and shows genuine command of the offense in high-pressure situations, then picking up that option feels less like a gamble and more like the obvious next step in his development. Even if the season falls just short of a division title or playoff berth, the way he responds to adversity, the way he connects with Chuba Hubbard, Rico, Tyrone McMillan, and the rest of the offensive weapons will carry just as much weight as the final record. Carolina has already invested years of coaching adjustments, scheme installations, and roster construction around him, and starting over at quarterback would reset every single piece of progress they have made since drafting him. That is why this confusing, frustrating, exhilarating season might end up being the turning point that defines the next era of Panthers football instead of just another year lost in the middle of a rebuild. If Carolina uses these last games to sharpen their identity and prove they can execute when it matters, if Bryce Young keeps stacking smart decisions and clutch throws that win tight games, and if core defenders like Derek Brown and J.C. Horn keep creating the turnovers and stops that give the offense chances to close out victories, then this year becomes the foundation of a new competitive window rather than a random hot streak that fades away. The team does not need to be perfect or flawless to change its trajectory. It just needs to show that the pieces already in place can grow together and complement each other instead of fighting against their own inconsistency. The real answer to why the Carolina Panthers make no sense in 2025 might be that they are still in the middle of becoming something bigger and more dangerous than anyone outside that building realizes. And the next snap Bryce Young takes will keep writing that story one play at a time.